Welcome back. I'm not going to say a word about the panel that we are so much looking forward to. I will just introduce our one and only Bill Morrish. I'm so excited that I actually don't have his bio in front of me, and I don't want to miss it. I'm sorry. Yes. Professor Morrish is a professor of urban ecologies, Parsons School of Design, of course. And he's an author of numerous publications. The latest one is The Waste Odyssey. And he is nationally recognized as an urban designer whose interdisciplinary research and practices applied to innovative community-based city projects. But the truth is that there is not enough literature that we could read to describe who Bill is. And he has been such an active and generous contributor since the beginning of our gathering, since yesterday, that I think that we all have a kind of a feeling that he's a friend. So, you know, without reading more of rubbish that is inapplicable, I'm giving the mic to you. Thank you very much for being with us.
It's all because I was a middle child, and which means I had to sit in the middle of the back seat. So I was always negotiating for a window, which is a very important skill for all of you to learn because most of our work is trying to get windows for people. So there you go. But I sat in the middle and had the whole panoramic view. So what I saw, as opposed to everybody, was like this. So I have a kind of visual problem. I see, actually do, physiologically, I see 120 degrees, so I don't know. So if I can see people attacking from this side or whatever. Okay. Couple of things. One, I want to thank Susan and everybody. This is, I can't get enough information, and you know I'll absorb it, and I'll send it back to Susan, and then she'll try to edit it, but which is a whole nother experience. I am a designer. I've been a designer my whole life, and I like to sort of say that as a designer and architect and landscape architect, halfway through my career, I was trying to understand why are these situations the way they are. I was handed a project, and I didn't realize I was handed a situation. Why is it this way? So halfway through my career, I decided I would be an urbanist upriver. And what happens when you go upriver, most of the times, if you use the Mississippi River, you get the project somewhere around New Orleans, and they say, can we clean the river? And you go, yeah, let's have a workshop and see how far we get. And maybe if you're lucky, you get to Baton Rouge. But to do that, to really understand it, and that's where I come back into, there is a very powerful definition to design that's been buried under the word of process, that people do not believe is material. And that is the definition of design as design setting, which is the terms by which we name and frame the situation and the questions that we're actually going to pursue as activity. And that is a substantial body of work. And I've had a number of projects where I've made that material, because if people don't get that material in the hand, as I like to sort of say, they're not just building a bridge, but I really like that presentation. I'm interested in constant bridging. That if you want to build a bridge, you're in the process of bridging always, or you won't get it maintained. This is someone who's been in infrastructure for 40 years, and I'll tell you, there is no solution right now, so it's wide open. It's scary. But it's also, I'm interested in the active form of the city. And it's not just flow and network, it is the active form. And in fact, that's, to me, is the true city. I'm not a big fan of figure grounds. I'm not a big fan of GIS and planimetric maps. They're really interesting, but they're heavily embedded in a very small narrative. I've also been an activist for a long time in various different public works projects across the country, and I'd also like to say, which you can talk maybe at the end of the whole session, is that we are ending an era when I think we've raised questions, but we can't keep raising them. We have to begin to start turning them into real institutions, and we've been avoiding that question. We can't make any more NGOs. We cannot. They're just a stampeding herd. And that circle that Barbara showed of the Rockefeller Center, that places all the NGOs. And they all get $1,500. And that means we don't get any systems. That's my political statement about nonprofits. I won't even mention other issues. The other piece is, where do I work? And this is, I think, I've always been what I call kind of in the ecotone. For an ecologist, an ecotone is the space between two dominant ecologies, like between Palestine and Israel, that family. Those people live in an ecotone. It's a third world. It is not just a shared boundary. It is a world unto itself. And it is the space we have to work because boundaries are going to be our saviors because that's where the tissues and ties are made. Because boundaries are best when they are shared. Unfortunately, this is our discussion about Okios. When you go to public and private, there's no more tissue left. It becomes this side of the wall, that side of the wall. So what I've been working on, and I think Malik Simon in his writings on Jakarta, which I think is a very important city called the Cities of Uncertainty, he talks about not in between, but what's between us. What's between us that we find in common that is now our reference. Also our famous word connection, which is a whole nother issue. But more importantly, what anchors us? We don't talk about it. I think the work we saw in Poland and others is some serious anchoring in the borderlands where he asked the question, so what did you like? What did you do that was great? That's an anchoring question. So when I start with my students and my work, I don't start from the fact we've arrived at a problem on a border. I'm writing at a place of where are we planning to stay? And if we're planning to stay, what drew us here and what would keep us here? Now, that can be sound as, oh, that's really flowery and so forth. No, not really. It's actually a hard truth. The hard truth might be, as we saw yesterday, the inheritance question. If I'm planning to stay, I have to deal with this inheritance, my damn relatives, you know. I am not related to them. My name, it sounds like that, but that's not who I am, right? So we have to begin to deal with that and to begin to understand, as we saw in Warsaw, that these histories are like ecological toxology. They're plumes. They drift under currents for a long time. And sometimes when you stick something in the ground, like a fountain in the plaza, it raises things that have been down there. And I've been in a number of disasters. And the problem with disasters, like in New Orleans, it raised all the issues that were there anyway. The big one is massive racial injustice, which no one dealt with, because we're going to, quote, be resilient and get everybody to the high ground, which is not a big issue, which is a serious racial issue that a lot of people couldn't deal with. So these papers were really exciting. I really enjoyed them. The title, Wounded Landscape, is just so loaded that one is, I'm wounded, I will just sort of say, is the problem of not acknowledging how rich the word landscape is and how inappropriately it's used. Sort of not expanded upon. It's still kind of like, I say, let's study a landscape to my students, they go, oh, green park. And you go, no, please stop. Or you mean the romantic view of the world. Stop, please. How about sublime? Yes. Transcendental? Yes. Oh, but I want to talk about the city. Why do you want to talk about a landscape? Well, because essentially making the landscape makes the city. If you want to get all the way back to the Romans, digging the dirt and making a clearing is the beginning of urban. And everything outside is suburban. So all the stuff around the wall, Temple Mount, is a suburban activity happening inside the urban in there, which I think is kind of, a great new dimension on that debate. So what I thought I would do is introduce the three projects, which I think reflect three major rich definitions of landscape that multiple authors that I've been collecting, mostly outside of the design community, but in various different backgrounds, all the way from philosophy to humanism, American studies, and others, and in multiple language. They tend to be newer voices as well. The first one, Jilly Tragano, you set it up beautifully. She's going to look at Standing Rock. That's actually a map of the United States. Real quick, this is my ideogram. By the way, this is analog, so I don't have a density problem of the PowerPoint, so I'm not going to get stuck here. But I think it's important to begin to start talking about the landscape as this synthetic construction of material. that whether, quote, it's human or non-human, it's combined, and that's what a landscape is. It's the synthesis of both. And also, when you create a landscape, it's forever. You have to, it's like a dog, you can't just get them as puppies. And that means it's continual. And so the question is, how do you want to continue? So the question of the future is, how are we going to continue with the fact that we've initiated a process, a set of activities in this landscape, rather than we clean the place up? So in the first one, we'll be going out to Standing Rock, which is, I've been by there. I've actually been to Wounded Knee, which is not far from it. In the Dakota, Western Dakota, ecologically is a tough place. There's a whole problem of the narrative of the West, which you can talk about by the fact that it was described first by Easterners who didn't really understand what dry climate was, and got all confused and therefore used the word desolate a little bit too many times, and empty. And so the notion of empty space comes from, oh, there are no trees there, rather than that's all you get with inch and a half of rain a year. So what's interesting, Standing Rock, and they talk about the tribal origins, origin theories, and their protecting of the waters. They're absolutely correct. In fact, they're not only correct about their land, but it's on the Missouri River. The pipeline is connected into the hydrology shed of the Mississippi River, which drains 40% of the United States and goes through every major city and oil refinery on the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. So when there's a spill there, we'll be wiping out all of the tribes along the valley. And of course, the big crosshatch is the pipeline, which of course has nothing to do with the United States. It's about Canada moving to oil refineries, by the way, owned by our Secretary of State, and to be shipped to fuel to China. So you're having what William Cronin in his book, Nature's Metropolis, which I highly recommend, is the concept of second nature, which is basically the interaction of economy and ecology and the flow of capital and the flow and the structure by which we all, quote, define our existence, whether it's sustainable or not, or even solar-based, it'll still be that kind of question. Then we'll move on to my favorite, Southwest. I've been in northern New Mexico too. Really wonderful, very beautiful, sublime landscape. D.H. Lawrence had a great time up there. His wife said, "Get me out of here. I'm tired of living up here." And all the writers from L.A. used to come out and visit him up there off the Rio Grande Valley. But this notion of the sharing scarcity, which is an interesting notion about water. Water's always been a scarce question. In fact, one could say that any dynasty, all dynasties are based on hydrologic democracies or structures, China, India, and so forth. And the mythology and myth and reality of the laws of the Indies and the irrigation question. I grew up in the Central Valley of California. I know this game. But it also goes back to the origins of the Mediterranean, the keeping of the Islamic world, Umayyads and others, the keeping of the Roman texts that then got translated to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabel would be the last people to figure out how to move water around in Spain, and were able to adapt it. And so out of it comes the notion of res publica, which is the thing that's which common and share and needs to be open. And there were two systems that were res publica in the Roman Empire, and that was roads and water. And as we all know, when that stopped flowing, that was the end of that empire. And so that's really interesting. It goes right to the heart of the ecosystem or oikosystem, which I think what we want to talk about is not public versus private, the public realm versus domesticity, but most of what we're talking about is dwelling systems. And as I was saying, Terry Mead, that I've been looking at an 85-year history of the UN evolution and preparing for Quito, which is, Barbara Reed, I have so many good pictures for you of stupid things, but including all the SDGs, whatever those are. Is that this is a dwelling system, that they eliminated the idea of the notion of settlement. And settlement was replaced in the 80s by the Brundtland Report by development. And everything went from systems to projects that would trickle out. And from that point, I'd have to sort of say that was also Bush's and 1,000 Points of Light. The Volunteer Society was created on top of that. And we moved out of the social safety net system and the notion of getting people settled to the idea of mitigating projects by having people support. So there's a very, very clear history that I think we need to articulate to figure out where we are in this situation. And finally, just these beautiful projects line right up. Tanya with her film, which is totally useful for the notion that, again, the third definition of landscape by J.B. Jackson, there's clearing, there's scenery, and background or infrastructure, and you might even go on to, ubiquitous computing theory, ether, whatever. We won't go there yet. But the third definition is landscape as a background or infrastructure. And of course, when you get into that, you get into the issues of what Paul Edwards writes about in the notion of infrastructure and modernity and the modernist settlement model. We get into the issue of force, time, and social organization, which is the only way we can show it is by film, aerial photography, and a lot of other aggressive acts. So as we leave it, all landscapes are based upon grading, cutting, force. They're all about time, and they're all about having to maintain it through heavy gardening, which means we have to show up. The wounded part is to neglect them, is to understand that we have thrown away our own value of what we believe in as a community together between us. So with that, Julie, I was thinking of Julie Bardman, actually, who was out there too. Julie Traganow, thank you.
So there will be one translation was Bill's landscape sketch there, and the other translation of my talk will be the visuals that will run in the background, and will kind of have a life of its own in some way. So, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I will come to that. Yeah. Yes, sorry. Is this the play button? So. Placing a stone on the ground, a mattress on the floor, squatting in an abandoned building, cooking a meal for a community of immigrants and locals that never existed as such before, occupying a square for a sit-in, or establishing a homestead in a reclaimed territory can be acts of prefiguration. They are place times of both principle and make-do, imaginary and agency, idealism and materiality. They follow stories of injury or rejection. Destitution and scarcity are often parts of them, as well as the hope of their transcendence. I am interested in collective homes that establish a political manifestation, the will of a group of people that are resisting a certain condition, sometimes that of colonization, nuclear armament, or neoliberal politics of dispossession. My use of the term prefigurative draws from the political theorist Winnie Brins, who identifies a difference between strategic and prefigurative politics. The former are committed to bringing structural change in the political, economic, and social orders. The latter strive to provide living examples of alternative social formations. More than extending a critique to existing institutions or positioning themselves within a protectionist state, prefigurative politics embody a lived alternative. They prefigure a desired society by creating the new in the shell of the old. The Oseti-Sakowin camp of the Standing Rock in North Dakota began on April 1st, 2016, and was eradicated on February 22nd of this year. It opposed the plans of energy transfer to pass the Dakota Access Pipeline under the Missouri River and the Lake Oahe, which are the main sources of water for the indigenous Sioux population, posing a threat to their health, but also to that of a million others. The pipeline violates the treaties of 1851 and 1868, as well as recent United States environmental regulations. By late September, more than 4,000 people resided in the camp, with 1,000 more during the weekends. The camp was installed on unceded territory, which, according to the Treaty of 1851, is sovereign land that belongs to the Great Sioux Nation. The camp of the Standing Rock belongs to a lineage of non-statist presidents. Free breakfast for the Black Panthers, Avalon Alliance in Diablo Canyon in the 1960s, Greenham Common in the UK in the 1980s, or the more recent Occupy movement. I see their prefigurative function as the product of the designer's intelligence, and even when designers are absent from them. and I see design as a range of capabilities from the intention behind the basic acts of survival to the realm of socio-technical innovation. Members of more than 300 Native American tribes, as well as environmentalists, representatives of the Black Lives Matter movement and other liberation movements, indigenous communities from Norway to Palestine, whose sovereignty is being disputed, and groups of US veterans came to the camp. Acting upon earlier traumas, the wounded earth, injuries of war, racial injustice, the dispossession, evasion, and appropriation of national lands by various settlers, these disparate groups came together to the Standing Rock to act in alliance. It is tempting to read the Standing Rock through the template of the protest camp, which, while in fact it is a homestead. And while this protest is primarily an indigenous plea for liberation, it is also possible to see in it the genesis of a powerful, non-statist federation that claims a new global commons. There has been a lineage of violent acts in the history of the Sioux. There have been fights between settlers in the Sioux, culminating to the Sioux Uprising of 1862. There have been broken treaties. There has been forced relocation because of the building of dams. Today, pipelines are threatening to harm the water, the health, the sacred burial grounds of the Sioux, and their understanding of the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations. But according to historian LaDonna Braidbull Allard, this movement is not just about a pipeline. We're not fighting for a reroute, she says. We're fighting for our liberation, and the liberation of Unchimaka. We want every last oil and gas pipe to be removed from her body. We want healing. Water protectors, solar warriors, earth caretakers, garden warriors, walking wolves, runners to DC, doctors, herbalists, cooks, educators were constituents of this camp. Together with the river, the buffaloes, the wild geese, and the horses, they practiced their own idea of justice. They stood against the oil and the pipelines, the prophecy of the snake, North Dakota law enforcement, exploding police grenades, attack dogs, rubber bullets, drones, caterpillars, multi-million energy companies, and other power holders who, in synergy with each other, inflicted new wounds. On February 22nd, the camp was set on fire ceremonially by protesters themselves. What could a camp archaeology reveal? I have been recording the lexicon of things that are detached from the shell of the old and were assembled at the Standing Rock. Teepees, camper trailers, tents, square straw bales, firewood, pellets and pellet stoves, cars, Carhartts, winter boots, AAA batteries, flashlights, headlamps, milk crates, lanterns, solar lights, sewing machines, phone cards, gas cards, plywood, flooring, snow vehicles, ice chests, horse feed, snow shovels, walkie-talkies, lumber, propane, goggles, recycle bins, laptops, portable printers, solar chargers, renewable batteries, generators, wood stoves. Such heterogeneous and contradictory elements were recomposed into a myriad of assemblages. But this assembled cosmos is not to be taken for granted. Rather, it co-evolves with the social relations that are created right here in the camp. There is a multitude of practices to create and sustain the camp: building tents and huts, installing solar energy generators, employing canoes for bringing food supplies, creating collective kitchens and taking care of nutritional histories, nurturing each other, treating old and new injuries, lighting fires and praying, getting together to make decisions for the next day. Here, participants try an array of established and newly devised methods of inhabitation, from alternative energy consumption to radical everyday practices of sustainment and distribution of resources. Quote, "There are meetings all day. There is at least one meeting per day about construction. We have dedicated teams that work diligently for countless hours to winterize the camp. We look out for each other. We gather around fires at night and share food around tables, bustling with conversation and glowing with connection. Many of us are here to stay. Many of us are coming." End quote. I see the material practices of the Standing Rock as experiments in radical empiricism that create the affect and the radical habitus that are necessary for this non-statist assembly to emerge. Affect is a mode of somatic activation that changes the state of the body that has concrete effects on individual and social practice. It creates collective bonds beyond the realm of the symbolic. The term habitus, drawing from Bourdieu, means a set of embodied dispositions that people acquire by acting in society. But habitus has a generative capacity. It is not simply a mechanical reproduction of a learned performance. Social change, too, can be achieved through habitus and affect. The material practices of the Standing Rock articulate political arguments in ways that are different from the cognitive processes that are necessary for the expression of verbal political messages. They initiate an unspoken political. They provide the motivational energy that is necessary to move people from the endorsement of ethical principles to the actual practice of ethical behaviors. The collective ethics of the Standing Rock should not be taken for granted. As I look back to the formal history of the camp, I see a disconnected line from the settlers to the squatters to the protest camps, and I discern different ideologies and regimes of power that utilize the archetypal practice of homesteading. According to Alex Vasudevan, in the US history, squatting represented a form of violent displacement through which indigenous communities were dispossessed of their lands and livelihoods. Frontier settlers were in most cases compelled to become squatters, as the distribution of land was controlled by speculators and land grabbers. These settlers organized into squatter organizations while adopting a range of direct action tactics. The self-built informal communities of the squatters spoke to a kind of independent life, makeshift and precarious on the one hand, resilient and resourceful on the other, while indigenous communities were at the same time deprived of their own lands. While a post-settler vision is what brought some of the Standing Rock supporters to the camp, most of the indigenous population are here to reenact their own lineage and to defend their territories. Can these conflictual histories become reconciled? As the world has become unsettled again, with climate change and new waves of migration, these heterogeneous groups, despite their difference, seem to share a common intent: to become part of a community of change which begins with the making of this common home at the site of primal injury. This injured site that is in need of recuperation is a parcel of the world. Its wounds are not just localized, but deeply systemic. At the same time, it has its own history, being connected with a particular group that has been negated its territorial rights. The making of this imbricated homeland that we witness at the Standing Rock has therefore a dual task. On the one hand, its indigenous imperative, and on the other, the making of a global commons that cannot be achieved but with a simultaneous process of decolonization. What can the designer learn from the brief but wondrous life of this camp? For Ellen Scarry, it is a story of expressing physical pain that eventually brings us into the wider frame of invention. The elemental as if of the person in pain will lead into a series of counterfactual revisions that are entailed in the making. Bearing witness to the recurring injuries that were inflicting upon this imbricated site, the most important counterfactual design is the making of these embodied infrastructures. Central here is the idea that it is through a new radical intrasomatic engagement with things that the character of groups and individuals is being galvanized. According to John Dewey, the various publics do not exist a priori, but are generated through their engagement with the field of material transactions and their consequences. What a better embodiment of this prefigurative imagination than the water protectors? No walls, filters, or engines are delegated to protect what is valued, but rather this transgenerational, transcultural, sociopoetic bond, half human, half thing, that has been forged at the Standing Rock and travels towards us. Thank you.
Thank you, Malgo and Susan. I haven't met you yet, Susan, but thank you for having me here. So it's interesting, actually, to be here. Malgo and I just met because we're teaching together in the first year program, and we got to talking, just meeting with each other. And I'm like, yeah, I'm doing this project in New Mexico about sharing scarcity and mining my family's history. And she was like, I'm putting together a symposium on wounded landscapes. This is perfect, amazing. So here I am today, kind of half-baked in my project, here to talk to you about the progress of it. I'm an artist. I actually did my MFA here at Parsons, and I'm now teaching here, have been for the last 3 years. And I had the luck of getting accepted to do an artist residency at Santa Fe Art Institute, which is a program that's focusing right now on water rights in the area. So it's an incredible international program. It's still going on right now. Actually, some people who I did the program with here are here to hear the talk, which is very special because they were very much a part of this research. So I wrote this paper. I'm an artist. I don't typically write academic papers for my projects, but I put a lot of work into it, so I'm going to read you the story that I wrote here. So let's see. Jump into it. Sharing Scarcity, Why the Ancient Ethos of Hispanic Water Democracies Matters Today. So a quote from Dr. Silvia Rodriguez, who is one of the premier scholars in acequia culture. If you think about what a headgate is, the headgate is not just a physical structure, an archaeological artifact, it is also the concrete representation of an agreement to share the water that was reached by a long process of cooperation and competition. So acequia culture is a fact, a colonial fact, which relates very much to the previous presentation on Native American rights and their relationship, cultural relationship to the land, and how it's embedded and entangled always with water and their relationship to the ecology that is cited knowledge. Sharing scarcity, or the repartimiento as it is called in Spanish, is a term that I learned when I began studying the formal practices of acequias in northern New Mexico. It's the central ethos of these 500-year-old agricultural communities that dates back over 4,000 years with its origin in Assyria, which is ancient Mesopotamia, Syria, Iraq, Turkey. The fluid practices of Hispanic farmers during times of drought in the high desert of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado are based on sustaining the equanimity of everyone in the community, along with neighboring communities that share a single water source. If you are downriver during the drought, you rely on generations-old relations with those upriver and the very delicate skill of negotiation and problem-solving when times are hot. Acequia translates to mean the conduit of water, or one who bears water. The term was brought to North America in the 1500s by the conquistadores and was codified in the first water laws in the United States through the Spanish Crown Decreed Laws of the Indies. The term acequia has a double meaning and is a direct example of how culture and landscape are inextricably intertwined in the Chicano mestizo culture of the southwestern United States. This was particularly important for me because my entire family comes from this region. And so my work as an artist has always been dedicated, connected to researching sites that have been compromised by overdevelopment, by global warming, and it always, when you approach a project, it always involves the complexity of the community that has been there for a very long time. So it's not just making an art project, but it's really getting involved in the community over long periods of time. So like I said, this project really just started, but it's really about peeling the layers back on my own Chicano mestizo heritage. And so it's a very personal project, actually. Devin Pena, professor of anthropology at the University of Washington, states, by situated knowledge, we understand a dialectical relationship of humans to the biographical properties of place, in which over generations, the local culture accumulates a vast reservoir of knowledge dealing with the ecological limits of life in a specific locale. Pena is specifically arguing for an ecocultural understanding that de-isolates Chicana and Chicano studies, linking the field to perspectives within ecology as a way of understanding the full breadth of cited knowledge. Before sustainable practice became something one could study in school, Acequia communities formed cultural practices that functioned in service of a deep knowledge embedded in the ecology of their home, a knowledge that continues to develop today in the face of quickly developing technologies, invasive commercial development, and the precarity of global warming. So I started this residency by calling my mom. My research started really by calling my mom and asking her to tell me some of the stories that about our history, some of the stories of the fabled farmland that I've always heard about but never knew about. And so she started telling me about this place, El Llanito, which I had never heard of before. I had been, obviously, my whole life going back and forth. I grew up in California also, always impacted by the scarcity of water in some way, but more in an urban way. And so going between California and New Mexico, my whole life, I'd never heard of this place, El Llanito. So I Google mapped it, and we speculated together on the phone, where was the ranch? How do we find it? She hasn't been back there since she was a kid, on purpose, very deliberately. So I start looking at it from the perspective of with my artist perspective, interested in how the water infrastructure relates back to the Rio Grande. I find that this, the Algodones ditch, which is the one that she lived on, then connects with the Rio Grande really right up the way, like a few miles away from where she grew up. So there was this intimate connection for her of where they got their water. She knew where it came from. She played in that, where it connected with the river. There's an artist named Danny Lyon who recently had a retrospective at the Guggenheim, and I was stunned to encounter an installation on a wall that had El Llanito. This is after my mom had talked to me about the place, and the kids swimming in the ditch, the very ditch that she grew up on. So this is his photographs that I rephotographed in the installation of the Bernalillo main canal. And that was, I think, the bridge that we came to, and the memory of her swimming in that ditch. And Andrew Sanchez, who Danny Lyon photographed, he also made a movie called El Llanito, which is incredibly heart-wrenching and really addresses the poverty of that particular area. And I would say at that time, this is in the early 70s, the poverty that was very much a part of the rural Acequia communities. As time goes on, the Acequia communities start to become more middle class, and they change because people are not depending on agriculture and farming as much. The farms become more like glorified gardens, or they become singular crops. And then people start getting jobs doing other things. They start attending schools, and there are other types of economic engagements that happen within rural northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. This is going back to El Llanito and asking my mom, who refused to tell me any of the stories about her childhood. One thing that I know, that I've learned over the years about my culture, the Hispanic culture, is that there is an intense protection of the personal and history, and there are always these secret stories that I've been trying to uncover my entire life so far. And I think that this is kind of a really key point within my own artistic practice, and the reason why I am so dedicated to issues of landscape and land use in various areas in New York City and out in the Southwest. So I had to cajole her to get out of the car, and when we got out of the car, there wasn't much talking, and she definitely felt very uncomfortable. And so I just asked her to walk, and I photographed her. And in that moment, the experience of photographing her, the silence of everything was permeating inside of me. It was like her silence and her narrative was flowing through me. And it was just visible in the landscape. This is the acequia that she grew up on, and as you can see at this point, there's no water in the ditch, and the silt has blocked the desagüe, which is where the water flows from. And this image is just so symbolic to me of all of the narratives that are really embedded in the landscape through the sedimentation and the silt. So after that, this was a really palpable kind of beginning of a project, and so I continued on with research that I had started in New York, and there's a guy named Stanley Crawford who lives in the area. Wrote a book in the 70s, in the 80s, actually, early 80s, called Mayordomo, and he's an Anglo-American. He lives in a place called Dixon, New Mexico, more north than Santa Fe, and Mayordomo is the ditch boss, and it's in the acequia communities, it's the person, historically a man, but now also men and women, mayordomas, also a very prevalent within acequia cultures. And they manage a ditch for the period of a year. They're paid by a ditch commission, and they are responsible for maintaining the ditch and making sure that water is flowing from the main head gate through to everyone's plot of land on the acequia. So I went to go visit Stanley Crawford in Dixon. This is turning off of the road, Glennis and Hideaki, you remember this? And turning off and just seeing beautifully this acequia kind of meandering back into the chamisa and the pinon, and right next to this flowing river. And so this was our introduction to Dixon. Then we went to Crawford. This is Crawford's ranch. This is the entrance. He grows garlic now. He's in his 80s. And so he has people helping him, young people who are moving to the acequia and becoming farmers, maybe romantically, but still they're really invested in the land. I interviewed him, and this is his house. He's, a writer, and I just thought that this was a beautiful collection of what Stanley, kind of a portrait of what Stanley's about. And so we sat down and spoke to him for a while. This is the Bosque, Acequia de Bosque view that he took us to, and it's just really just watching the waters flow through there was a peaceful part of our discussion. And so I wanted to ask him, what is sharing scarcity? What does it mean today in comparison to what it meant when you first moved to the land in the 70s? Because it's such a different time now. I mean, nobody's really depending on an agricultural practice to survive. So the relationship to water is totally different now. And he said, well, sharing scarcity, when he first got to the land, he just remembers there was a period of 2 years of extreme drought. And at that time, because of the drought, the community was meeting literally every Sunday. And they were making decisions collectively on how to manage this lack of water. Who's going to get the water? At this point, the community decides every week, they reiterate it to each other, and they make a commitment to it that nobody will get more than the other person. Everybody, and he acknowledges that this was not enough water to, make a farm. So nobody was having a full-fledged farm. Everyone was having just little bits, and they were sharing it. And so everyone was sharing this lack of food for 2 years. And it's just this act of coming together every Sunday for a period of several hours, arguing in heated debates about water, and at the end deciding that none of them will have water. And that's really, it's the most futile process. Nobody got anything, but they had to reiterate their commitment to sharing as a community, and that was really what was the important. It was the act of the commitment every Sunday. Today, they still have these. It's a required process because the acequias are actually They are acknowledged by the state as communities that have their own elected officials. They are acknowledged as kind of micro democracies. They're water democracies. They have the obligation of meeting at least once a year to decide what's going to happen with the ditch, what's needed. So they still, the new people, the young people who are moving very much are committed to coming to these meetings and participating. And according to Stanley, they are really taking on and taking very seriously the traditions of the community. So then what I was really interested in was, as an artist, I often do performances in the landscape where I visit a landscape and I revisit it, and I let the landscape kind of choreograph the things that I'm doing, and I document myself and make these videos that I consider to be choreographed by the landscape. And so I was interested in a tradition that happens in Acequias called the limpia, which means cleaning. So every year in the springtime, right before the season where they're going to open the ditch, so the ditch is dry all winter long, before they open the ditch, they have to clean it all out. And they have to fix the infrastructure, and they have to take out all the debris. And so who's going to do this? The community has to come together to do this. It's the young generation, the kids of the Parciantes. These are the stakeholder members of the Acequia, what's called the peones, which are the workers that get hired. And they come together with the mayordomo, who he leads the ditch cleaning almost like a very well choreographed performance. It's a beautiful thing. I'm going there this spring to participate in an Olympia in Truchas, which is a small community not far from the Embudo area, the Embudo Valley, where Stanley lives. But these are photographs by a woman that I met with a few times, Donatella Davanzo, who's a social anthropologist at the University of New Mexico. And she has documented the limpias several times because she was doing a 7-year research project on them. And so I'm going back this spring to participate, to observe, to learn from the literal gestures of cleaning and maintaining the landscape as a way of bringing maybe those gestures of maintenance into my work. And so far, what I've been able to learn and glean from some of the research that I've done is that this idea of water democracies and small communities that survive only because there's such insistent participation is so, relevant to what we're seeing in our own culture right now with all of the protests and, the protection of our democracy through protest and coming together and activation through many different forms. And so I feel like it's incredibly timely to be looking at this very ancient practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, I was trying not to talk or not to write anything because I'm a PhD student and that's all I do. So I'm just going to show, a video of this project I'm making. And on that note, on the program, it says that I'm a PhD candidate. I'm just a student. And hopefully by May, I'll live up to the program. But for now, I'm just a student. So I don't know if that means a lot to you guys, but I was very concerned about it. I'm trying just to make these videos as something that can be used by whoever wants to use them. So I'm thinking of it more as an archive than as a documentary or as a film. So I use it this time. We're going to use it to talk about a wounded place, but I imagine it as many other uses. I'm still in the process, I'm going back, and in the process I'm dealing with a lot of contradictions about what I'm making, why I'm making it, and from what perspective, and who I'm talking about it with. And the idea behind the cat I'm showing, it's also to think about how consent changes the perception of a wound. So that was the idea. I'm not sure if it's going to play. Okay, great.
Buenas tardes, señor.
Bueno, de la bombacha.
Ya Vendrá. Dice que estuvo para el Inti Raymi.
Sí, estaba.
Vendrá, pues.
A la vista viene, pues, a ver cómo es.
Comadre, ¿cómo estás, comadre? Feliz de
voy a bajar, te vas a subir. Sara, agárramelo. Cosa, agárramelo. Ven, trae tu mano. Dásale. Una, dos, ya.
제일 방탄해.
Amapun aku angkus kapture nina Ricky eja menyimpat muka iku Toma, no salud con todos mis soy kamu mana maritura ini capek pintar muka pinsel kamu
pinches dicen que matarte. Y estas toman de estas acabando, yo también quiero.
Y Elian, como para decir algo que le gustaba a la gente, dijo: en Chinchero se va a construir el aeropuerto internacional. Y según ellos, que desde que Elian dijo eso, como que de ahí la idea se volvió más concreta. O sea, eso es lo que dicen la gente del pueblo. Realmente no sé cómo ha sido como de manera oficial o burocrática, pero ellos dicen que desde ese momento todo el mundo aquí se creyó que aquí iban a construir el aeropuerto. Entonces desde ese momento se empezaron ya a proyectar como qué pasaría, ¿no?
Thank you.
I'm going to open up the conversation because I think, and then from there we can come back and capture some ideas. So Yes.
Last one.
Nowhere was a place in Peru. I probably got it from Thornton Wilder's The Bridge of San Luis Rey, where there's this bridge, and they think they're going somewhere, but they're going nowhere. They're going into the abyss. In other words, their life is over. Apparently, Chinchero is in the middle of nowhere. Now, there's an advantage to be in the middle of nowhere. As the guy said yesterday, build a house in the middle of the block, and it's going to maintain itself. If you're on the edges of the corner, they're going to bulldoze you right away, because that's an advantage. So being in the middle of nowhere is a kind of a potential. It's a psychic potential. The airport, it's that dream. It's like Robert Musil, the man without qualities. They're going to have this tremendous festival of the anniversary of this empire that's going to disappear. It's never going to be there. There's never going to be this kind of a thing. So there's some deep psychic realities going on there. And apparently the point that you're making is that the people are very happy to live with this fantasy, this positive fantasy of an airport in the middle of nowhere that may never be, but it, in a sense, defines them, where they are, who they are, in a positive sense. That's the vibe I'm getting.
Yes, I mean, in general, since I've been going there, it's people want the airport, and in fact, there has been some delays, and the only protest that erupted very recently was because the building of the airport was going to be delayed because of these corruption scandals with the central government of Peru, and in fact, they had a symbolic first placing of the first stone of the airport because they are tired of waiting for it. So they took over, they occupied the land of where the airport is going to be built. This just happened a month ago, and they had this symbolic inauguration of the airport. So now, and because there was such the whole region protested and mobilized. So the current president of Peru flew there and they had the official inauguration of the airport. So I'm going back in May, and I think that they're actually going to start building the airport now. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a fraction of the younger generation that are opposed and that are questioning, but in general, because of the autonomous government of the indigenous people in Peru has an autonomous government, and the Chinchero is an example, they agreed to have the airport, so everybody's moving forward together with that decision. So it is, in a sense, like you say, it's positive. Yeah.
I love the tactic of actually taking over the project by saying, oh, I love this idea, I think we should have, a mixed-use community. Before the developer gets there, just go start it yourself. I think maybe they should start at the airport, it might be way better. There's something to that.
Christine, I'm just curious, you mentioned that you're in the middle of the project and you're talking mostly about your research. How are you going to approach it as an artist? Do you have any?
Yeah, it's interesting because I decided not to include any images of the work that I made. So I didn't include any video. I also made, while I was there, I made a 25-foot long cast adobe channel, basically, that breaks apart in fragments and situated within the context of the gallery. It's joined with text and kind of vinyl lines on the ground that extend the cracks, and it becomes a walking timeline. And then the timeline, working backwards and then speculating into the future as well, serves as a formal guide for the video that I'm doing, and also a series of collaged images that look at the site of acequias and actually terraces and all of the forms that were playing out in the landscape that I was in. So,
what are acequias? I don't know I don't know what that means.
Oh yeah, I guess I skipped over that because I didn't read from my paper. Acequias are in the United States. They are 500-year-old agricultural communities that were part of the colonial history. So the acequias literally means the ditch, but it also means the community that gathers around the source of their water to share the water together. And acequias are primarily Hispanic communities, and they also interact because they share a river with the pueblos in the area, and also with the city itself. So they have to negotiate how to share if they're down or upriver in times of scarcity or drought. And then they're also political entities because they have actual laws and they're recognized by the state as an entity.
Trans-tribal. They're not tribal.
They're not tribal. They're not native.
They're not native.
No, but they do very much associate and have the entire time, obviously through colonial history and interaction with the pueblos in the area. So for instance, and Sylvia Rodriguez documents this beautifully in her book, but there is this whole art to the negotiation and the repartimentio that if there's no water and they have to go and make an appointment with the mayor of the pueblo, which is also another political identity, to talk about, well, can you let us have some extra water from yours? So you've got all of these diversions coming off of the Rio Grande. One diversion might be going into the pueblo, another one might be going down into a specific acequia, and then down to another acequia. And so they have to come together, the mayordomos, the mayor of the pueblo, they have to come together and decide that maybe the pueblo is going to give them some of their water. And it's really mathematically decided as well how much water they get. It has a certain measurement that goes back 500 years, and so it's very well documented that the native people in the pueblos and the Hispanic farmers have really developed and have been quite successful at this negotiation.
Closest thing in the West version would be an irrigation district, which you'd find all across the western United States, up through Central Valley, farm cooperative irrigation districts. And the mathematics of negotiating is very interesting. One little detail in reading the ditches, and I swam in a ditch too. It says sign, no swimming in ditch, and there'd be like 10,000 kids in the ditch. But, well, there's no pool, so yeah, it was 100 out. But you notice that one ditch you're doing, it's lined by concrete and then earth. So what's interesting when you read ditches, that was not original. The original was the silt. But to get more water out at scarcity, they'd line the ditch knowing that they would lose 3 to 5% through percolation into the dirt, and then they would make projections. And so there's this whole game of projection of what the outcome would be. And so when these systems become privatized, which happens globally, then the downflow has to do with how they sold the water off. When it's socialized, it's upriver going, how's it going to be distributed? So when it gets privatized, it goes the other way, where you say, like it's happened in Colombia, the water rains on your farm, and you go, oh, like, rain bucket. No, you can't keep it because we already sold it to the factory. In Guatemala City, we've already allocated, so even though the farmer's going, but it came from the sky, you can't hold it because it's already done it. So you shift that relationship, and it's always negotiated because everybody wants more water than there is in the system. So there's all these games.
Right, there's what's called paper water, right, which is the ownership of water that's not really water. It's just a certificate that you own this water that doesn't exist.
Los Angeles invented it. It's called appropriation, as opposed to riparian. We have a better use for it. Owens Valley, never mind.
Chinatown, right? But when you say 500 years, I mean, certainly it can't be the same masses of water. I mean, climate change, geographic change.
So acequias are based on gravity flow. So it's mostly harvesting water that comes from somewhere. It's the watershed. Right. So they've through the process of extending the water flow from the watershed, they've extended this whole riparian landscape through those particular areas, and thus really changing the ecology and the landscape of northern Mexico. And so that's been a process of ecological change within the landscape that has gone on for the last 500 years. That area also traditionally, historically goes through mega droughts, long periods of drought, which they're going through right now. California wants to say their drought is over, but I think it's a complete joke because as we know, the landscape needs to hold water and replenish itself over at least the next 5 years before it can actually recover from the drought. But yes, these are the same water sources that they've created through harvesting from the watershed itself, which was not there at all. These are hand-dug canals, by the way, and what I showed you was a larger acequia that has been, the infrastructure has changed since my mom lived there, and it's now a cement-lined ditch. But the whole point of making this cast adobe trench was because these are earthen trenches that are hand dug by the people over miles long, so the Anasazi also did this too in Arizona, where they dug the ditches and then they lined the ditches with adobe, thick adobe clay, so there would be less seepage. But now with the state, they just do it with concrete, which destroys the ecology and the possibility of growth. That's the whole beauty of having these ditches, is because they also serve to extend the riparian ecosystem. If you line it with cement, there is no growth. There's no extension.
But you'll have to maintain it. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for the really lovely panel. I had a question maybe predominantly for Chidi. But also maybe a comment about the progress of our event. How many more words now we have in the lexicon than only those that have been wrote by the title. So I was particularly struck by your lexicon and by the archaeological deep into the words that mattered materially on the site of the camp. It was very intense as you uttered it. And since I somehow believe you will do more with it, what direction might you be taking? In a very different way.
Well, I don't know, because it's very embryonic, obviously. It's just 4 or 5 months that I started working on it. And now I have no absolute possibility of going there because it doesn't exist anymore. So, it could be like talking more with people who have been there and, challenging them through these kind of notions that I have developed, not just to hear, the experience, but see how they feel about this idea of materiality, and through that, this kind of human infrastructure emerging, testing this idea, whether this was really the case there. So it could happen in that way, or I could expand on the notion of the prefigurative and look at different examples and how each of them brings a kind of a variety, a difference to the notion. Because I didn't expect to discover here this kind of doubleness. The imperative of the indigenous and the global at the same time, and also the incompatibility of the two. I would think that these two are almost equal, but here I find them being in conflict, and that's what I discovered by talking to people, especially indigenous activists.
Can you elaborate on the conflict? I didn't get that.
The conflict is that I believe that the indigenous population do not trust necessarily the post-settler consciousness that the other members of the camp bring with them. So they find this as two different directions that are not necessarily compatible with each other. While I would initially see the global commons as the main aspect of it, but by talking to people I realized that this is the least of interest for the indigenous who started the camp.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But if we go towards the idea of embodied infrastructure, which sort of is underneath, it sounds like a very interesting project, then the idea of habitus, and that shifting over to that language is a very different way than commenting on the division of infrastructure and so forth, or even Keller Easterling's infrastructural space. And it seems to me that's a kind of potential to go around and understand from other situations like we have here, what's the embodied infrastructure notion of this airport? If they've already initiated it, could you co-opt it and redirect it? Rather than having a consultant company come in and say, this is a tourism spot in Machu Picchu, how would you shift that?
Say a landscape architect was given the job to do tourism, not you guys just popularized these two sites. What if you went on to have another lecture, another talk?
No.
In the airport site and in the Standing Rock?
Sorry, what's the question?
What would a landscape architect go and build at Standing Rock and at the airport?
If there was a landscape architect going
Yeah, they
there
got a bunch of
after,
money,
after
and what
the
would they build?
eradication of the site,
Yeah.
well, I can imagine golf courses on top of the pipelines. I don't know. It depends on who is the landscape architect. It depends on who the landscape architect is.
Hypothetically.
If I were this landscape architect,
You're talking about this site. Now I'm drawn to go there, and somehow those new uses need to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so what would a landscape architect do?
well, we can imagine from memorials to what existed, even temporarily, to an array of possibilities based on the different politics that this landscape architect would bring together. Who is inviting this landscape? I cannot see architectural design alone without an ecology around them that brings this into being, this design process into being.
Okay.
So.
Back there.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing this wonderful work. I think it's great. And I have a question for you. It's about social imagination and the future of this community. Because you are talking about the airport, right? So you were there and you were spending a lot of time there. So I was wondering if you can share a little bit more about how the community is seeing this change in their everyday life, right? I mean, besides the airport, what are the main changes or, I don't know, transformations that the community see coming, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, this is my, so first maybe it wasn't clear, but the airport is happening. It has already been, I don't know if that's like, I'm speculating so much that now everybody's just an imagined airport. No, it's happening. And the new constructions I showed, those up in the hill, people imagine them as future hotels, and there's already huge resort hotels being planned out on the outer skirts of Chinchero. So this is already happening, and it's a very big deal in Peru, even if it's a new topic maybe here, but in Peru everybody knows about it. So one of the main changes that has happened since then is the people that were living on the land of the airport received an unimaginable amount of money from their perspective. Some of them $250,000. And there used to be, like a socio-political order that followed social division of labor. Like at the bottom were the Yanaconas, who are the farmers and that work the land. And then the people that do textiles had more prestige because they did some, that was perceived as like higher way of labor. And since the land has been changed, this order has shifted, and the Yanacona are the ones that were living at the airport, so now they are what we would understand like as the new rich. And the people in the party that I showed that had like the minions and the iPad, they happen to be the Yanaconas. They changed because they now have a lot of purchasing power. Those are one of the changes, and the interactions between groups have changed as well as a consequence of this influx of money. The Yanaconas are looked with suspicion by the other communities. Usually when I go there, I stay with Augusta, who you saw cooking the guinea pig. She lives in another area in the more in the old part of town, so they tend to be very untrusting of the Yanacona. So that's one of the main changes, and then there are other ones that are, but that's a big one. Yeah.
I wonder if Christina, the idea of the tragedy of the commons, the article by Gerald Harding from the 60s, which says that it's a tragedy because everybody will grab for themselves, resources for themselves. What you showed us, in a way, counters that. And it's a fantastic, I think, example of how that doesn't have to be the case. I'm just wondering if it's something you've been looking at.
It's something that the communities are really facing in a big way right now because there are, the Acequia communities are being reevaluated for the way that they're using the water itself. So there's a law in New Mexico that is to the effect of use it or lose it. So if you don't use the water in a quote beneficial way, and that term is constantly evolving concept for the law, then you'll lose the right to that water source. At the same time, financially and economically, the people are really struggling in these communities, and so you have big businesses, fracking industries, you've got developers coming in and really approaching individuals within the community to buy their water rights within the Acequia, which is not necessarily possible. The Acequia also has the right, and this is something that they've been really kind of fighting to define more stringently, but they have the right to decide amongst the Acequia community that they don't want to sell it. It's not for a beneficial use. They don't want to let that person sell the water right, but it's still happening. And so individuals are selling their water rights. That breaks apart, obviously, right? So then you have a diversion going from this small community, and one diversion going off to some rich tourist guy who's setting up a B&B or something like that.
Because instead, sorry, I can imagine that this could be an amazing example for us to learn how to organize, today.
Absolutely, and that was my impetus.
Kind of version.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that I think it's kind of naturally happening. I think that we have that instinct actually as people. When we start to lose basic rights, our ability to participate and say we don't want this to happen, and we're going to naturally incline to do that. And so that's why I think there's this interesting doubling that's happening on a much larger scale within our society. But if we could learn, I live in New York City, so I'm also paying attention to what does it mean to share scarcity here. One example that I noticed the other day was just going into the subways, and as our subway ride is increasing and is about to increase again, you get people swiping each other in. You see somebody coming out, they swipe somebody else in for free. And there's this like understanding. It's very informal, but get on. Yeah, we all agree this is way too much money and we should all have access to the subway, So there are examples of sharing scarcity, and I'd love to, segue into how that's happening in an urban environment and, show that, visualize that in some way as an artist.
One more question? Yeah.
I have one that I'm almost embarrassed to ask, but Julie, one of the most moving parts of your presentation was your litany of things. Yeah. As I was listening, the idiot in me is going, well, here's all this talk about preserving the land, and half of those things are poisoning the land. Yeah. Was that your point?
Well, that's what I said right after, that these are heterogeneous and contradictory elements, but what is more important is the practices that recompose them into something new and something different. So, and this is the idea that this new, the prefigurative, is made in the shell of the old. It's not necessarily reinventing every single substance, but the question is the new configuration that emerged out of them rather than the primary objects themselves. So instead of waiting to reinvent everything for the new to come, we can start recomposing and reassembling what is already here. I think that's the idea of the prefigurative politics.
But also, just to also question a little bit about that, there's just from my experience with Native cultures and reservations, that there's a contradiction. Also, there's a much larger contradiction in the culture. And there's a connection, a cited knowledge of the ecology, but what we think of as, from a distant perspective as being so respectful and ecologically sustainable doesn't always filter into daily practices, especially in very difficult economic situations. Sure. So, there's this contradiction. I think people go to Standing Rock and they think, Native people operate like this in this fantasy world, and then they see, oh my God, there's so much pollution going on just regularly by people who live here. I can't believe this. And it just kind of bursts your whole fantasy about what Native people
Well,
are.
I don't have that fantasy.
I'm not saying you do.
No, I know. But it just, what I'm struck by, though, is not that it exists. The question is what to do.
What is that?
That
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to stay with the lexicon. I want to continue with the list of practices.
Right.
And also how the subjectivities are being made through this process of coming together and trying to bridge all these issues.
But
There's
also how we
contradiction.
do it, how we do it in sites where there's indigenous communities, but it's also how we do it everywhere. It's not just because the indigenous, you know, they have a connection with the land, but we are all doing it the same.
By the way, this was partly the list of requests they were making for donations. They wanted many of these items. Yeah. So some of them emerged by looking at this visual material, and some of it emerges from what they said they wanted.
So I'll end up with a kind of comment from my friend Jeffrey Cohen, who edited this book called Prismatic Ecologies, Beyond the Green Eco Theory, which I recommend. And in it he talks about is that we need to understand this when we get deep into this. All of a sudden the murkiness becomes this rainbow of refracted things, refracted ideas, multiple colors, and a realization that it's much richer and that it involves transactions and relations. And that's the problem with the tragedy of the commons article. He doesn't understand what a commons is. It's highly transactional. It's all about strengthening weak ties, which I think is the origin of the landscape story, which is constant regeneration, heavy gardening, the digging of the ditch is not something extra, but is fundamental to the basic dwelling process, which is the fundamental basis of the city, rather than the city being one of just real estate. And that's shifting the language, and that was, clearly shifted in the 1980s. So we'll stop at that moment, because you don't want to get into a neoliberal landscape conversation. Thank you very much.